was ceremoniously driven into the ground before a crowd of workers and dignitaries. With the railroad's completion, the travel time for making the 3,000-mile journey across the United States was cut from months to under a week. This made the economic export of Western resources to Eastern markets easier and increased the speed of westward expansion. As settlers entered newly accessible territories, conflicts with Native Americans increased. During this time, the exploits, both real and exaggerated, of notorious outlaws gained the perpetrators' infamy at the time, and an enduring legacy today. Wyatt Earp, former Marshal of Dodge City, Kansas, moved to Tombstone, Arizona Territory in 1879, with several of his brothers in search of riches from the silver boom. While there, the Earps ran into a gang of outlaws called the Cowboys, led by Ike Clanton. The Earps all had law enforcement backgrounds, with Virgil Earp acting as both town marshal for Tombstone and as a deputy U.S. Marshal. They teamed up with the temporary policeman Doc Holliday. The lawman had a long-standing feud with the Clanton gang, but things came to a head when Virgil made the decision to enforce a city ordinance prohibiting carrying weapons in town, which meant disarming the gun-toting cowboys. This intervention led to the shootout at the OK Corral, a 30-second gunfight that nevertheless became symbolic of the Old West, a time when the frontier was virtually lawless as a consequence of lawmen being spread incredibly thin over vast territories. The beginning of the Gilded Age, a period characterized as much by wealth and abundance as by poverty and corruption, was in fact a notable ending. The year 1877 marked the end of Reconstruction, and therefore an end to one of the greatest periods of civil rights reform in the country's history. Efforts by the federal government to help protect the rights given to African Americans after the end of the Civil War were abandoned as a result of a compromise struck to settle the contested 1876 election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden. Hayes, a North Republican, was granted the presidency and Reconstruction was ended. Federal troops were withdrawn from the South, no longer interfering to protect African American civil and political rights. The systemic violence, disenfranchisement, and oppression that followed would persist for more than a century and come to be called Jim Crow as the federal government gave up on its promise to give free black men the rights of citizens in the South. Sharecropping and low-wage work, such as domestic servitude, were some of the only options available to freed people in the South. But depending on who you were, what you looked like, and where in the country you were, economic opportunity could abound in Gilded Age America. Cheap land and relatively high wages compared to other parts of the world drew in immigrants by the millions. Between 1877 and 1900, approximately 7.3 million people immigrated into the United States. Prior to 1880, most came from Western Europe and China. But closer to the turn of the century, more immigrants came from Southern and Eastern Europe. They settled in every area of the country in large numbers, except for the economically devastated South. But their appearance triggered political and social backlash from Americans who felt their white, Protestant country was being threatened. Movements to resist certain types of immigrants, including Catholics, Jews, and Chinese, gained momentum. In the West, sentiments against Chinese workers were particularly hostile, and mobs were known to gather and attack Chinese people living in areas of Wyoming and Washington, driving them out. Congress restricted Chinese immigration to the U.S. beginning in 1892, continuing to uphold the policy until a permanent exclusion policy was enacted in 1902. Fear of minority groups festered among white Americans after the Reconstruction period, and was only further fueled by the influx of immigration, leading to anti-democratic efforts to restrict certain groups from voting. As immigrants flooded into the country, many of them went west. As a result of the Homestead and Railroad Acts of 1862, the federal government had handed most of the lands owned by the Native Americans over to railroad corporations and white farmers, including immigrants. The Homestead Act did not require American citizenship, and the railroad sold land grants at low prices, even going so far as to advertise in Europe. Advances in technology, such as improved plow designs, meant just one family could officially farm a large area of land without need for intensive effort or hired labor. But not all farmers were happy. Increasingly, political movements like populism were drawing in hard-pressed wheat farmers of the Midwest and resentful white cotton farmers in the South who were fed up with wealthy elites, monopolistic corporate interests, and gold. Nevertheless, farming became so efficient that the country was producing more food than it could consume, so the excess was exported. This was all made possible by the expansion of railroads that had occurred in the 1850s and 60s, for they made previously inaccessible land much more feasible and profitable to work. Between 1865 and 1898, America's output of wheat increased by 256%, corn by 222%, coal by 800%, and the miles of railway track by 567%. The nation's economy revolved around the railroads, which trucked commodities like wheat, cattle, silver, and timber from place to place. The first transcontinental railroad opened in 1869, and railroads were a rapidly expanding area of the new economy. By 1890, nearly 800,000 people worked for a railroad. However, railway work was poorly paid and often dangerous. Even as wages were rising and quality of living for skilled workers in America was outpacing that for those in England, mechanization was steadily replacing those skilled workers with unskilled ones who could be paid less. The distribution of wealth in the Gilded Age America was highly unequal, with the top 10% owning more than 3/4 of the nation's wealth. This disparity, along with the poor working conditions that affected the everyday lives of wage workers, inspired a number of vicious worker strikes. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 lasted 52 days before it had to be put down by federal troops and the National Guard, but only after the fighting had resulted in over 100 deaths and workers having burned several railroad cars and engines. Another big railroad strike occurred in 1886, involving more than 200,000 labor union workers. On May 4, 1886, a gathering at Haymarket Square in Chicago to protest police brutality against striking workers turned into a riot when someone threw a bomb at police officers trying to disperse the crowd. In the ensuing chaos, 7 police officers and 1 protester died. Searching for those responsible, police in Chicago and elsewhere rounded up radicals, labor organizers, and anti-capitalists, selecting 8 men who were tried and convicted for the events at Haymarket Square. Though some found the trial's evidence to be weak and saw the convicted men, most of whom were given the death sentence, as martyrs, for many others the takeaway from this event was heightened anti-labor sentiment. Nevertheless, efforts to improve labor rights continued. In the Pullman Strike of 1894, widespread striking and boycotting severely disrupted rail traffic in the Midwest. The strike occurred in response to pay cuts that the Pullman Palace Railroad Car Company made to its workers' already low wages. The company did not, however, correspondingly reduce rents and other costs in its company's town of Pullman, Illinois, near Chicago, where the majority of its workers lived in company housing. Workers and their families were starving, but the company's president refused to make any changes and ordered those that complained to be fired. The workers decided to strike. Some of the workers belonged to the American Railway Union, and union delegates found a way to support the strike. ARU members across the country would boycott the Pullman Company, refusing to hitch Pullman-made cars to trains and unhitching any Pullman cars already attached. The strategy, masterminded by ARU president and future U.S. presidential candidate Eugene V. Debs, soon had 125,000 workers on 29 railroads quitting work rather than handle Pullman cars. Some estimates say the number was closer to 250,000 workers across 27 states. Though the strike was successfully holding up trains, workers were still angry, and in addition, they set fire to engines and engaged in various riots. President Grover Cleveland sent federal troops to Chicago to quell the violence and obtain the court injunction, which said the ARU could no longer communicate with any of its members nor do anything to stop its members from working. Violence erupted between the striking workers and the federal troops, culminating July 6, 1874, when more than 6,000 rioters destroyed hundreds of rail cars in the South Chicago Panhandle yards. The strike only finally came to an end when the railroad started hiring non-union workers to replace those it lost. The train started moving again. The ordeal had cost the railroads millions of dollars in lost revenue and destroyed property, and the strikers had lost more than $1 million in wages. The Pullman Company was forced to divest its company town, which became part of Chicago, after the federal government conducted an inquiry and called the company's actions in the town un-American. In the aftermath of the strike, in an effort to placate still angry workers, the Cleveland administration designated the first Monday in September as Labor Day. But public sentiment had been stirred against the strikers, who were largely immigrant workers. The influx of immigrant workers took advantage of the growing number of industrial jobs available in cities. But these jobs tended to be exploitative and low-paying as well, even as the country's GDP became the greatest in the world. Wealthy Gilded Age moguls such as John D. Rockefeller, Andrew Carnegie, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and J.P. Morgan were known for their philanthropy. But their critics also labeled them robber barons for building their empires on the backs of an exploited working class, using tactics like intimidation, union busting, fraud, and monopolies to gain an edge on their competition. Muckrakers, or journalists who exposed corruption among the elite, helped draw public attention to these issues. In 1906, Upton Sinclair published The Jungle, his famous account of the grisly, dangerous, and unsanitary conditions in the meatpacking industry, which resulted in public outcry and legislation. Ida Tarbell wrote a 19-part series for McClure magazine in 1902 about Rockefeller, resulting in his Standard Oil Company being broken up for being a monopoly. Meanwhile, as the rich got richer, the cities were filling with tenements and slums as their populations grew. Another muckraker, the photographer Jacob Riis, became famous in 1890 when he published a book called How the Other Half Lives, depicting his photographs of New York City slums, which prompted city officials to try to improve the conditions there. When the Great Blizzard of 1888 dropped between 40 to 50 inches of snow on the New York area, more than 200 people died in New York City alone, most found buried in snowdrifts along city sidewalks. But in contrast to the extreme poverty, technological marvels like new bridges, trolley lines, subways, elevators, and skyscrapers were bringing the cities into the industrial age. Thomas Edison invented a long-lasting light bulb in 1879, and the Pearl Street Power Station was bringing electric light to a small number of customers in New York City. By the light of the electric light bulb, people read newspaper accounts of the Kentucky meat shower, a mysterious event that occurred March 6, 1876. Residents of Olympia Springs, Kentucky were shocked to find large chunks of meat falling from the sky, which was never fully explained despite attempts to investigate it, though the favored local explanation was that it was vulture vomit. Construction on the Brooklyn Bridge, which connects the city's boroughs of Manhattan and Brooklyn over the East River, began in 1869. When it opened in 1883, it was the longest suspension bridge in the world. It was an architectural and engineering accomplishment masterminded by John Augustus Roebling, who had developed his own method for weaving wire cables. After an on-site accident killed him at the beginning of the project, his son, Washington Roebling, took over management of the project. At least 20 workers were killed during construction, and many more were used to construct the foundations of the bridge towers. Workers toiled inside the caissons underwater at nearly double the normal atmospheric pressure, and when they returned to the surface, had symptoms of what was then called caisson disease, but today would be known as the bends. When decompression occurs too quickly, bubbles of nitrogen form in the bloodstream and can result in sharp pains, slurred speech, muscular paralysis, vomiting, and cramps. Washington Roebling, too, suffered from the caisson sickness and became bedridden, though his wife, Emily Warren Roebling, stepped in to serve as a liaison between her husband and the construction team. When the bridge was finished, she was the first person to cross it by carriage, carrying a rooster as a symbol of victory. The Gilded Age was a time of enormous economic swings, with the United States experiencing unprecedented economic growth, but also marred by economic downturns that sent prices crashing. In what became known as the Panic of 1893, problems with international investments, including failed land speculation in South Africa and Australia, and a railroad bubble caused by the railroads overbuilding and vastly outpacing demand, led people to make a run on banks, withdrawing their money. A series of banks failed, and many companies went bankrupt, including the Northern Pacific and Union Pacific Railways. This led to a huge spike in unemployment. Many people also lost their life savings in the bank collapses. Numerous farms had to cease operations, and stock prices declined. People faced starvation, turning to any work they could find to help feed their families. President Grover Cleveland was blamed for the crisis, and his administration had taken heat for the way it put down the Pullman strikes. So his Democratic Party suffered big losses during the elections of 1894. In the next presidential election in 1896, the Democratic candidate William Jennings Bryan was backed by the Populist People's Party, but he failed to beat the Republican candidate William McKinley. By the end of the Gilded Age, many people had become fed up with extreme wealth inequality, abusive tycoons, and widespread poverty, and were ready to usher in a new era of reform when, after McKinley was assassinated, President Theodore Roosevelt took office in 1901. By the end of the 19th century, the United States seemed to have achieved its manifest destiny. The country now stretched from one ocean to the other. It had survived a horrific and bloody civil war and stood on the precipice of a new century. Now, looking to expand its political, social, and economic resources outside of the North American continent, the United States began to extend its influence on neighboring islands and territories. The first was the Hawaiian Kingdom. Located 2,400 miles or roughly 3,900 kilometers from the U.S. mainland, the Hawaiian Islands had been ruled by the Kamehameha dynasty since the late 1700s. In 1846, under the presidency of John Tyler, the United States had recognized the independence of the Hawaiian Kingdom and opened trade with the island nation. Enterprising Americans also secured vast sugar plantations on the island, and American-born immigrants began to flood to Hawaii. The United States and the Kingdom of Hawaii had frequent disagreements over the sugar trade, and while the Hawaiians appealed for relief from the U.S. government, it was frequently ignored. As the presence of U.S. natives began to overtake the island, so too did the presence of the U.S. military. On January 1887, the U.S. began leasing Pearl Harbor from the Kingdom of Hawaii, giving U.S.-born Hawaiians the confidence to begin plotting against the Hawaiian natives in the government. In July 1887, they launched a rebellion and forced the king to agree to what has become known as the Bayonet Constitution, which stripped the king of many of his powers and gave more power to the foreign white plantation owners. In 1891, the Hawaiian king Kalakaua passed away, leaving the throne, an unsteady government, and an economically crippled Hawaii to his sister, Liliuokalani. Queen Liliuokalani immediately began work trying to undo the damage done by the Bayonet Constitution, and by 1893 was preparing to organize a rewriting of the Hawaiian government. In direct contrast, the Committee of Safety, a political council of white U.S. and European-born landowners, began raising forces to once again overthrow the government. Both sides quickly mobilized troops, and the Committee of Safety declared the Queen deposed and established a provincial Republic of Hawaii, led by Sanford B. Dole. The U.S. Navy responded to a request for aid from the new provincial republic and arrived to keep the peace, naturally in favor of the American-born rebels. The Queen was placed under house arrest and never attempted to fight back, hoping to avoid any unnecessary bloodshed. In Washington, President Grover Cleveland reacted with shock and horror and condemned the provincial republic as an illegal coup, which did not have the support of the U.S. government. Despite this, and several inquiries into the events which had caused the coup, the Republic of Hawaii was officially declared legitimate in 1894. Queen Liliuokalani made clear her opposition to the unlawful coup for the rest of her life, but maintained that her decision not to fight the US-backed rebels would save lives. In February 1895, on the island of Cuba, rebels were fighting for independence from Spain's colonial rule. Graphic portrayals of Spain's efforts to quell the rebellion were shared by several U.S. newspapers, and among the American public, support for the rebels grew. The fighting also created economic and political instability in an area very close to the U.S., which concerned some Americans. In April 1895, Spain announced an armistice and instituted a program to give Cubans limited powers of self-government. However, the U.S. had long been interested in ridding the Western Hemisphere of European colonial powers. The U.S. saw its opportunity when an American battleship, the USS Maine, mysteriously sank while stationed in the Havana harbor on February 15, 1891, killing 268 members of the crew. Using "Remember the Maine" as a call to action, pro-war propagandists drummed up public support for the conflict, blaming Spain for the sinking of the Maine. The U.S. quickly issued resolutions that declared Cuba's right to independence and demanded the withdrawal of Spain's armed forces and authorized President William McKinley to use force to ensure the withdrawal occurred. The U.S. also stated it had no intention to annex Cuba itself. The Spanish government rejected the Americans' ultimatum and immediately severed diplomatic relations with the U.S. McKinley responded with a naval blockade of Cuba on April 22, 1898, and issued a call for 125,000 military volunteers. First, U.S. forces attacked the Spanish naval squadron anchored in Manila Bay in the Spanish colony of the Philippines. The fleet was destroyed in just 2 hours, and Commodore George Dewey even paused the Battle of Manila Bay to order his crew a second breakfast. Fewer than 10 Americans were lost in this battle, while the Spanish lost almost 400. Next, American forces zeroed in on the Spanish Caribbean fleet. Under General William Shafter, an army which included future President Theodore Roosevelt and his 1st Volunteer Cavalry, the Rough Riders, advanced on land toward the city of Santiago. The Rough Riders were instrumental in the Battle of San Juan Hill, in which they captured the hill and used it as a strategic place from which to attack the Spanish military stronghold in Santiago. The U.S. Army drove the Spanish Navy out of Santiago's port by approaching the city from multiple points. Then, the U.S. Navy proceeded to destroy Spain's ships on July 3rd, allowing for a relatively safe siege on the city. A ceasefire was signed August 12th. The U.S. military's force had so dwarfed Spain's power that future Secretary of State John Hay described the conflict as a "splendid little war." The Treaty of Paris officially ending the war was signed December 10, 1898. In it, Spain renounced its claims to Cuba, ceded Guam and Puerto Rico to the United States, and transferred the Philippines to the United States for $20 million. However, Filipinos were not happier under American control, and the Philippine-American War began in February of 1899 and lasted until 1902. 10 times more U.S. troops died suppressing revolts in the Philippines than in defeating Spain. The McKinley administration also used the Spanish-American War as a pretext to annex the independent state of Hawaii. The U.S. emerged from the war a world power with a new stake in international politics. This would soon lead the U.S. to play a determining role in the affairs of Europe and the rest of the globe. Spurred to action by the suffering caused by recessions in the late 1890s, the turn of the 20th century was characterized by a desire for change. Many people were tired of the tight alliances between powerful Gilded Age politicians and businessmen, as well as the problems caused by rapid industrialization and urbanization like the growth of slums, widespread pollution, and increased exploitation of labor. With former Vice President Theodore Roosevelt newly established in the head office after President William McKinley was assassinated, the progressives were set to transform the American landscape into something far more modern. Roosevelt, who at 43 was the youngest president in the nation's history, came into office in 1901, with enthusiasm for the public good. Unlike presidents before him, he wielded the Sherman Antitrust Act to break up monopolies, including the railroad owned by J.P. Morgan. The company, Northern Securities, controlled almost all railroad shipping across the northern U.S., and in 1902, Roosevelt went on the offense and took the matter to the Supreme Court, which sided with Roosevelt. And whereas the former president, Grover Cleveland, had sent federal troops to quell a railroad strike in the 1880s, when Roosevelt was faced with a large-scale coal miner strike in 1902, he sent representatives to serve as neutral mediator. Roosevelt easily won re-election in 1904, campaigning on his Square Deal platform of trust-busting, conserving natural resources, and protecting the consumer. Like in the Gilded Age, immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe were continuing to arrive in the U.S. in large numbers during the Progressive Age. Between 1900 and the outbreak of war in Europe in 1914, more than 13 million immigrants arrived. This meant the issues of slums and tenements that were so prevalent during the Gilded Age were only growing. The progressives, who were mostly middle-class, white social reformers, saw the urban poor as a social concern. As early as 1889, reformers Jane Addams and Helen Gates Starr opened Hull House in Chicago, one of the first social settlements in North America. It provided social services, including early child education and adult education, to poor immigrants. Progressive activists each had certain issues they felt were more important to address, so reform movements were a patchwork of efforts that covered a wide swath of social ills. Some progressive reformers sought to expand the powers of government to rein in the negative aspects of capitalism. Companies could no longer simply operate unregulated with the advent of state factory inspectors and public health bureaus, which were tasked with minimizing unsafe working conditions, stopping poisoned food from being sold, and tamping down on contagious diseases. One event that prompted greater corporate regulation was the Great Molasses Flood of 1919, which occurred in Boston when a tank containing 2.3 million gallons of molasses exploded and sent a wave of the sticky molasses through the streets of the city. The wave was said to move at up to 35 miles per hour and be up to 25 feet tall. 21 people died and more than 150 were injured, and an area of several blocks was flooded up to 2 to 3 feet. The tank was used by the Purity Distilling Company to store molasses before it was taken by pipeline to be fermented to produce ethanol, an ingredient in alcoholic beverages and a key component in munitions. Though the company claimed the tank was blown up by anarchists, a class action lawsuit was brought on behalf of the victims, and a court-appointed auditor found the company was responsible. It was one of the first class action lawsuits in Massachusetts and provided cash payments to the families of victims. Progressive reformers sought to clean up big business and the government in a variety of ways, including through the adoption of more amendments to the Constitution. The 16th Amendment, which made it legal to graduate the income tax based on a person's income, was added in 1909. And the 17th Amendment attempted to make elections more fair by instituting the direct election of senators, rather than by state legislatures, which could be controlled by political bosses, in 1913. Other political reforms sought to give citizens more direct control over their governments by instituting the initiative and the referendum, which let citizens put proposed laws on a ballot without needing support from their legislators. Reformers also sought to streamline government via the short ballot, which was intended to increase government accountability and clarity, and public utility commissions sought to stabilize the pricing of city gas and water supplies, streetcar fares, and railroad shipping, while zoning boards and city planning commissions sought to clean up slums, improve polluted water supplies, and bring order to chaotic land markets. Other reformers focused on preventing the spread of venereal diseases, stopping prostitution, and taking other measures for public health and morality. Among these, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Anti-Saloon League, and the Young Men's Christian Association, YMCA, led efforts to promote temperance, or abstaining from alcohol, and discouraging premarital sex. Temperance and prohibition were causes taken up by a great number of progressive reformers, who saw alcohol as an evil that spawned a variety of other issues like domestic violence and poverty. These activists, known as the Dries, helped set the stage for various states to pass legislation banning the sale, possession, or transport of alcohol. In 1907, Georgia and Alabama were the first states to go dry, followed by Oklahoma, Mississippi, North Carolina, and Tennessee. By 1917, 2/3 of the states had some form of prohibition laws, and roughly 3/4 of the population lived in dry areas. With the passage of the 18th Amendment to the Constitution in 1919, which kicked off the era of alcohol prohibition in the U.S., this patchwork was given federal support. Not all reform projects were undertaken by middle-class white people. The Progressive Era also saw black communities in the segregated South take up reform projects, like improving schools, seeking out larger shares of state budgets, engaging in legal action to secure equal rights, and environmental efforts. At the same time, however, the country was deep in a period known as the nadir of race relations, which brought some of the worst racial violence and racist policies into being. During this time, African Americans lost access to many of the rights improvements they had gained during the Reconstruction period. Violence, lynchings, segregation, and legalized racial discrimination all proliferated. In reaction, African Americans began increasingly to move north, in a period known as the Great Migration. Many of those who migrated moved to northern cities such as New York, Chicago, Cleveland, and Philadelphia. They still faced serious hostility, as well as segregation and widespread racism. In the Midwest and West, many places were known as sundown towns, which promised African Americans that they would face violence if they remained there overnight. When President Woodrow Wilson was voted into office in 1912, he made new efforts to segregate the federal government's facilities. The 1915 film Birth of a Nation celebrated the original Ku Klux Klan and is credited with bringing the Klan back into power in the 1920s. More power, in fact, than it had ever had before. By 1924, the Klan had 4 million members and significant influence over the governments of several southern and western states. Mob violence against African Americans was widespread. 36 cities across the U.S. saw white supremacist violence in the summer of 1919, which became known as the Red Summer. White mobs murdered at least 43 black men that year, but a report delivered to President Wilson indicated that the states were unwilling to take any action to prosecute the murders. Many former black soldiers who had returned from deployment in World War I were angered and frustrated by these conditions after having fought for their country. From a progressive reform perspective, many people felt that race relation problems actually stemmed from a society that was being integrated, and reformers fought for increased segregation. Between 1895 and 1910, progressives in southern states helped deny black people the right to vote by popularizing the Grandfather Clause, which restricted voting rights to men who were allowed to vote or whose male ancestors were allowed to vote before 1867. This disenfranchised black voters because the 15th Amendment, which provided them the right to vote, was not passed until 1870. The Supreme Court declared the Grandfather Clause unconstitutional in 1915, but its use persisted. It was not until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that the 15th Amendment was enforceable. As the black vote was being forced out, voting power for white women was on its way in. Organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union advocated for women's suffrage, while they worked on other issues like prohibition. In addition to sexist attitudes of the time, some opposed female suffrage because they feared the women's vote would tip the scales on issues they were against, such as eliminating child labor and prohibiting alcohol, and increase the share of socialists in the voting pool. In 1916, Alice Paul formed the National Women's Party, which was focused on getting women the right to vote nationally. When the U.S. entered World War I in 1917, to replace the men who left to fight, women moved into workplaces that traditionally were closed to them. The 19th Amendment, which prohibited discrimination in voting on the basis of sex, was adopted on August 18, 1920. The U.S. sought to be a world leader in other areas. The quest for an explorer to reach the North Pole, considered the last unexplored area of the Northern Hemisphere, inspired competition between British, Norwegian, and American teams. Numerous journeys were attempted. In 1909, the New York Times announced that explorer and former U.S. Navy Commander Robert Peary had successfully reached the North Pole. But his victory was marred by another American explorer, Frederick Cook, who claimed he had visited the pole a year earlier. The competing claims drew significant controversy, with people unsure of who to credit with the victory. Newspapers polled their readers on which explorer they thought had been victorious. In January 1911, Peary appeared before a subcommittee of the House of Representatives to defend his claim, which narrowly voted for Peary to receive recognition for the feat. The Bill of Recognition that was signed into law by President William Howard Taft, however, did not credit Peary with the North Pole's discovery, but rather more generally lauded him for his Arctic exploration. The question remains today whether Cook or Peary ever made it to the pole. In 1904, the U.S. took over efforts from the French to build a canal that connected the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through a 50-mile stretch of Panama. The idea of a Panama Canal dated back to the earliest explorers of the Americans, who realized it would be a useful shortcut between Europe and Eastern Asia. Under direction from President Roosevelt, the U.S. fought back mosquito-borne illnesses, stubbornly excavated through the local mountain range, and devised a system of locks and dams that would move boats across uneven water levels. The canal officially opened on August 15, 1914, and at the time was the most expensive project in U.S. history, costing the U.S. government around $375 million at the time. Added to its cost is the human toll. Thousands of workers died during its construction, but good records were not kept. At least 5,600 workers were listed as having been killed between 1904 and 1913, but this is thought to be a significant undercount. The construction of the Panama Canal proved to be a critical boost to global trade routes for the 20th century. It would later be recognized as one of the marvels of the modern world. It was one of the progressive era's most notable technological achievements. As European countries took sides in the conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia in 1914, President Woodrow Wilson declared the United States was going to remain neutral in what was then being called the Great War. However, after a German submarine sank the British ocean liner Lusitania in 1915, killing over 1,000 people, including 128 Americans, public opinion on U.S. involvement began to change. In 1917, the British intercepted a coded message from German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to the German minister in Mexico proposing an alliance between the countries to take back Mexican territory if the U.S. were to enter the war on the side of the Allies. Public outcry against this plan, as well as against the ongoing German submarine attacks on non-military vessels, led Wilson to ask Congress to declare war on Germany. Congress agreed on April 6, 1917, and soon passed the Selective Service Act, instituting the first draft since the Civil War, leading about 2.8 million men to be drafted alongside another 2 million who joined the military voluntarily. German Americans were required to register themselves with the government, and thousands were arrested and interrogated. Some were interned for the duration of the war in 2 prisoners of war camps located in Georgia and Utah. At first, the home front was relatively unprepared to support the war effort. The entire economy and U.S. population needed to help keep the money, soldiers, food, supplies, and munitions flowing. The federal government created many new agencies to help the economy pivot to support the war effort and to produce propaganda. A week after declaring war on Germany, Wilson established the Committee on Public Information, a bureau dedicated to creating pro-war propaganda. Using photographs, movies, rallies, scripted speeches, press reports, and public meetings, the CPI fostered American patriotism and stoked anti-German sentiment. With the passage of the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918, criticism of the government or the war effort was essentially outlawed. A particular focus was put on children and youth organizations, who were expected to teach patriotism and to help encourage support for the war. The U.S. Food Administration instructed the American public to economize their food budgets and grow what were known as victory gardens in their backyards to feed their families. A constitutional amendment applied an income tax to high earners, and businesses faced other new taxes on their excess profits, which all helped fund the war. Most new funding, however, came from the sale of war bonds. Many women began working in traditionally male professions to assist the war effort, such as on assembly lines making munitions. Others worked for the military as support personnel or nurses stateside and overseas. The Army Signal Corps employed female switchboard operators to help with communication along the Western Front. These women were highly trained and bilingual in English and French. But because the War Department forbade women except as nurses in hospitals, they were hired only reluctantly. Ultimately, women were accepted in order to free up more men for the front. American men who went to fight in France were enthusiastically greeted by the worn-down Allied troops, the first elements of the American Expeditionary Forces under the command of General John J. Pershing arrived in France in June 1917. By early 1918, U.S. forces were arriving at a rate of 10,000 a day, which had a significant impact on the Allies' ability to push back the Germans' powerful spring offensive. While American commanders initially were using flawed tactics that others had already abandoned, resulting in attacks with high casualty rates, the infusion of U.S. troops contributed to the Allies' strategic position and improved morale. During the 100 Days Offensive by the Allies in 1918, American forces launched the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. Over 47 days, 1.2 million American troops drove the Germans back 40 miles. More than 26,000 American soldiers died. The 100 Days Offensive helped the Allies win the war, which was officially declared won on November 11, 1918. Overall, in less than 6 months of fighting, the U.S. suffered 53,402 battle deaths, and another 63,114 people died from accidents and disease. The U.S. promptly ended wartime contracts and brought troops home, but the U.S. at the time lacked programs to help veterans readjust to civilian life. In January 1919, the U.S. joined the other allies in Paris to negotiate peace. President Wilson brought a list of 14 points, some of which ended up in the final agreement, including the creation of a League of Nations, the first worldwide intergovernmental organization dedicated to maintaining world peace. The Treaty of Versailles was signed on June 28, 1919, but the U.S. never ratified the treaty, and instead made a separate peace treaty with Germany. Wilson, a Democrat, had refused to bring any leading Republicans to the peace talks, as he sought peace without victory. Republicans controlled the Senate after the election of 1918 and were outraged that Wilson refused to discuss the war, as they wanted Germany's unconditional surrender. Because the senators were divided, Democrats supporting Wilson against the irreconcilables, or the Republicans and some Democrats who were against the treaty, it proved impossible to obtain the two-thirds majority needed to pass. The Democrats who opposed the treaty represented those among the American public, mostly Irish Catholics and German Americans, who were intensely opposed to the treaty because they thought it favored the British. On November 19, 1919, for the first time in its history, the Senate rejected a peace treaty. Under Wilson's successor, Warren G. Harding, the U.S.-German peace treaty was signed August 25, 1921. The treaty allowed for American-German cooperation not under the purview of the League of Nations. After the First World War, the U.S. entered a time of post-war recovery. The economy boomed, construction took off, and consumer goods like automobiles and electricity became far more accessible. The decade was a time of bold innovation and experimentation, as well as significant backlash to these things from people who didn't like the direction the country's culture seemed to be taking. This tumultuous time became known as the Roaring Twenties. For the first time ever, in the 1920s, more Americans, 51%, lived in cities than in villages or on farms. New norms, which were the product of trends that had been building for decades, transformed city life. particularly for women. At the start of the decade, between 1/4 and 1/3 of unmarried urban women workers lived alone in private apartments or boarding houses rather than at home with their parents, according to old Victorian culture. These new women visited public amusements like dance halls, amusement parks, and movie theaters, which drew in young people going on dates, a structure that was replacing the old courting culture. People now had time for such things. As factories and shops mechanized, the urban blue-collar worker was spending less time working. The average work week fell from 55.9 hours in 1900 to 44.2 in 1929, while blue-collar wages rose by 25%. Many Americans had extra money to spend in the 1920s due to rising incomes and easily available credit, and it was becoming increasingly socially acceptable to spend money on consumer goods and accumulate debt on those goods, even if they were not absolute necessities. The nation's total wealth more than doubled between 1920 and 1929. People bought tickets to the movies to see stars like Charlie Chaplin and Rudolph Valentino. By the mid-1920s, movie theaters were selling 50 million tickets each week, a sum equal to roughly half the US population. They bought ready-to-wear fashion, which was being mass-produced and therefore becoming more affordable. They bought radios. In the first ever live radio transmission to the public, radio station KDKA in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania broadcast the presidential election results on November 2nd, 1920. By the end of the 1920s, there were radios in more than 12 million households. In 1912, an estimated 16% of American households had electricity. By the mid-1920s, more than 60% did. Appliances that required electricity, like the washing machine, the freezer, and the vacuum cleaner, were popular purchases. And people bought automobiles, which were an affordable luxury. The Ford Model T cost $260 in 1924, which translates to just about $4,000 today. But even as some people were experiencing wealth and prosperity, others were struggling to get by. Extreme wealth inequality, which had troubled the progressives and defined the Gilded Age, persisted. The income of the top 0.1% of families equaled the income of the bottom 42% during the 20s. And over 40% of Americans got by on less than $1,500 each year, or the poverty line at the time. Most people living outside of cities did not experience the prosperity of the Roaring '20s. Farm prices hit rock bottom in the aftermath of World War I. The proliferation of cars meant people were more able to travel wherever they wanted, and many of the young people of the day wanted to go out and dance at jazz clubs. Jazz music was brought north by black artists who had come from New Orleans, where the form originated. Chicago became the art form's new center, with the city boasting more than 100 jazz clubs. Whites and blacks began mixing socially for the first time in the black and tan clubs of Chicago. Poet Langston Hughes wrote that midnight was like day, referring to the city's music-filled nightlife. Musicians such as Louis Armstrong, Jelly Roll Morton, and Ethel Waters drew crowds to dance halls, and people danced in new African-American-inspired styles. The Charleston, the Cakewalk, the Turkey Trot, and the Flea Hop were all popular dances of the time. Some major dance clubs of the time were the Cotton Club in Harlem, New York, where Duke Ellington's band played, and the Grand Terrace Cafe in Chicago, where Earl Hines' band played. Later, the center of jazz music moved to New York City, where the Harlem Renaissance was in full swing. But because jazz music was pioneered by African Americans and represented a departure from traditionally white forms of music, significant backlash built in response to jazz's rising popularity. People decried it for the supposed moral disasters it created, its roots in black culture, and some termed it the devil's music. By the end of the 1920s, at least 60 communities across the nation had banned jazz from being played in public dance halls. Radio stations carried jazz tunes to listeners across the nation, and 100 million jazz phonograph records were sold in 1927 alone. But because of discrimination and racism, these were mainly recordings of white bands that sounded similar to the black musicians who pioneered the genre. Thomas Edison, the inventor of the phonograph, ridiculed jazz music, saying it sounded better played backwards. Anne Shaw Faulkner, president of the General Federation of Women's Clubs, a powerful alliance of women's social and reform groups that launched a crusade against jazz in 1921, once said that jazz was originally the accompaniment of the voodoo dance, stimulating half-crazed barbarians to the vilest of deeds. The increasing visibility of black culture in jazz and blues music, as well as the appearance of millions of African Americans who moved north during the Great Migration, inspired significant racist backlash. Millions of people joined the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, raising its membership to 5 million by 1925. By mid-decade, the group was in control of the governments of Indiana, Texas, Oklahoma, and Colorado, and was enormously powerful in several other states, including California and Georgia. The fundamentalist conservative paramilitary group initiated white supremacist violence, and also targeted Jews, Catholics, Asians, and the so-called New Women. One of the worst instances of violence was the Tulsa Race Massacre in 1921, when a mob burned the black neighborhood of Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, to the ground, killing dozens. The KKK only grew in power in Oklahoma after the incident. In general, the 20s were a time characterized by nativism and anti-immigrant feelings. A Red Scare in which people attempted to hunt, expose, and prosecute communists occurred from 1919 to 1920, and the Klan-backed National Origins Act of 1924 severely restricted immigration from Eastern Europe and Asia, while favoring immigrants from Northern Europe and Great Britain. The federal prohibition of alcohol in 1920, which banned the production and sale of alcoholic beverages nationwide, was as much inspired by reformers wishing to cure the country's ills of poverty and violence as by those who were against the growing population of urban-dwelling immigrants in the U.S. Anti-German sentiment after World War I inspired the nickname Kaiser Brew for the beer made in German breweries. Beer, as well as wine, whiskey, and gin, were all banned under the statute, but enforcement proved nearly impossible for the federal government. Smuggling and bootlegging were widespread, and speakeasies, or secret clubs that served illegal alcohol, popped up in cities. In 1927, there were an estimated 30,000 illegal speakeasies, twice the number of legal bars before Prohibition. Federal agents conducted raids on these establishments looking for lawbreakers, but prosecuting the cases proved tricky. In New York, 7,000 arrests for liquor law violations resulted in 17 convictions. Organized crime, such as mafia groups and gangs, worked a profitable and violent black market for alcohol, which flourished as consumer demand went unmet via legitimate means. These organizations operated in part by bribing police officers and federal investigators. Al Capone's Chicago organization reportedly took in $60 million in 1927 and had half the city's police on its payroll. John D. Rockefeller, who did not drink, observed in 1932 that because of Prohibition, drinking has generally increased. The speakeasy has replaced the saloon, and a vast army of lawbreakers has been recruited and financed on a colossal scale. While that may have been true anecdotally, other reports suggest that nationwide, drinking actually decreased during Prohibition. According to statistics, drinking-related deaths from cirrhosis of the liver in men fell between 1911 and 1929. Further, it has been found that alcohol consumption levels did not rebound to their pre-Prohibition levels until the 1960s. All good times must come to an end. Decreased consumer demand, you can only buy so many cars and radios, and mounting consumer debt, coupled with overconfidence in buying stocks, meant stock was highly overvalued. On what would become known as Black Thursday, October 24, 1929, the stock market crashed, triggering the worst economic downturn in American history. The Great Depression, which marked the end of the overconsumptive, free-wheeling, roaring 20s. Millions of stock shares ended up being worthless, and consumer confidence vanished. The resulting decrease in consumer spending caused factories to slow production, laying off workers. By 1930, 4 million Americans looking for work could not find it, and by 1931, that number was 6 million. Many Americans with debt were unable to pay it off and had their homes foreclosed upon. Homelessness became more common. The construction of the Empire State Building, which would be the first building in the world to have more than 100 floors, had broken ground only a few weeks before the stock market crash. Many tall buildings were being planned and constructed during the late 1920s, a facet of the optimism inherent to the period. This race into the sky included 5 other proposed buildings, but only the Empire State Building would make it due to the crash of 1929. The project was completed in just 1 year and 45 days, a record-setting speed. But because of the Great Depression, there was virtually no demand for office space, and the building sat mostly empty until the 1940s. In addition to the economic woes, in 1930 severe drought swept from Texas to Nebraska, bringing with it high winds and dust that killed people, livestock, and crops. This became known as the Dust Bowl, and it inspired many more people to migrate from the plains to the cities in search of work. From 1930 to 1933, the economic crisis only continued to get worse as thousands of banks were forced to close. President Herbert Hoover tried supporting the failing banks, but Hoover was a Republican who believed the government should not directly intervene in the economy or provide economic relief. In 1932, with close to 15 million people unemployed nationwide, voters overwhelmingly elected Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt, who took immediate action. During his first 100 days in office, the Roosevelt administration passed legislation to reform and reopen banks, stabilize industrial and agricultural production, and create jobs. The unemployment rate in 1935 was at a staggering 20%. So, via executive order, Roosevelt created a permanent jobs program called the Works Progress Administration. From 1935 to 1943, the WPA employed 8.5 million people, building schools, hospitals, roads, and other public works, as well as in arts projects, employing tens of thousands of actors, musicians, writers, and other artists. At its height in late 1938, more than 3.3 million Americans worked for the WPA. They built more than 4,000 new school buildings, erected 130 new hospitals, laid roughly 9,000 miles of storm drains and sewer lines, built 29,000 new bridges, constructed 150 new airfields, paved or repaired 280,000 miles of road, and planted 24 million trees to alleviate loss of topsoil during the Dust Bowl. Among the most famous projects built by the WPA are the Hoover Dam on the Colorado River, New York City's Lincoln Tunnel, the LaGuardia Airport in Queens, and the iconic red San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge. New Deal funds were also used for the construction of Mount Rushmore in South Dakota. U.S. Presidents George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Theodore Roosevelt, and Abraham Lincoln into the side of the mountain were carved by a total of about 400 artists. Tools were forged by blacksmiths, and tramway operators shuttled people and equipment to and from the base of the remote mountain. The project cost nearly $1 million, about 85% of which was from federal funds. The WPA was criticized for the project's slowness and inefficiencies, but it was celebrated for the employment it offered millions of people suffering during the Depression. Other notable New Deal programs included the creation of the Social Security Administration to protect older Americans financially, the Agricultural Adjustment Act to help farmers get out of debt, and the U.S. Housing Authority was created to address homelessness. The National Labor Relations Act was passed to protect labor organizing in 1935, and the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 set maximum hours and minimum wages for most workers. But not everyone was a fan of Roosevelt's reforms, with conservative opponents calling them government overreach. After the elections of 1938, New Deal policies became more difficult to enact because the new Congress was less liberal and less supportive of spending. The election of these new conservative members of the Congress was largely due to a dip in public opinion towards the Roosevelt administration during the economic recession of 1937 to 1938. With Roosevelt claiming responsibility for the previous economic improvements, people blamed him for the backslide. Nevertheless, the New Deal's popularity helped the Democratic Party remain the majority party in national politics into the 1960s. When the Second World War kicked off in Europe in fall 1939, the vast majority of Americans were still in favor of isolation. President Roosevelt, however, realized the importance of ensuring that Britain and France had every chance of success in the conflict. When France fell completely in June 1940, Roosevelt began implementing a Lend-Lease program with the British, sending war material and humanitarian supplies on American ships. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese fleet at last appeared and struck at the American naval base in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The attack did serious damage to the fleet, destroying 3 battleships and damaging several other vessels. However, the Japanese were unsuccessful in destroying the American aircraft carriers. The attack shocked and appalled Americans. Japan had hoped the attack would cripple the American Pacific Fleet and allow them to swiftly take control of the Pacific theater. Instead, the Americans recovered with nearly inhuman speed and in less than 6 months struck a devastating blow against the Japanese Navy at the Battle of Midway. The American victory at Midway opened the Pacific to the U.S. fleet and allowed for U.S. ground troops to be safely shuttled to Japanese-held islands. In Europe, following the general declaration of war on Japan after Pearl Harbor, Adolf Hitler, the leader of Nazi Germany, declared war on the United States, joining his Axis ally. The United States, now a part of the Allied powers, was eager to help Britain regain control of the European theater. The War Department began planning a series of military operations to retake North Africa and Europe from fascist control, whilst simultaneously planned for a prolonged invasion of the dozens of islands in the Pacific to aid Australia and the Philippines from Japan. The United States was again at war, and this time facing enemies on 2 separate fronts on a global scale. The entire country mobilized, with millions of men enlisting to serve, and the millions left on the home front adapting to produce war material and other goods to support the war effort. Sadly, the fear and xenophobia towards Asian Americans caused by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor led Roosevelt to issue Executive Order 9066, ordering the internment of any and all citizens who posed a national security threat to the country. With much of the west coast of the United States divided into military districts for the prosecution of an overseas war, over 120,000 Japanese Americans, more than 2/3 of them born in the United States, were removed from their homes and settled into camps further inland and away from U.S. military operations along the west coast. Roosevelt's administration, as well as the Army High Command, immediately realized the importance of liberating Europe as soon as possible. The early victory against the Japanese Navy at Midway gave the U.S. Armed Forces a chance to reassess their strategy in the Pacific while planning for operations in Europe. After some debate, North Africa was chosen as the first landing site for U.S. troops to begin the liberation of the Allies in Europe. In fall 1942, the Allies launched Operation Torch to strike a quick and decisive blow against the Axis-controlled North African coast. The assault was a massive multinational operation involving the United States, the United Kingdom, India, Canada, the Netherlands, Free France, and Australian forces. Over the course of a week, the Allied powers fought for control of major ports along the African coast, and were successful in occupying much of Morocco and Algiers. Operation Torch was the first step in an Allied advance, which would gradually take control over all of North Africa and move on to Italy by the fall of 1943. In the Pacific, U.S. forces embarked on what was known as an island hopping or leapfrogging campaign. Utilizing the strength and speed of the U.S. Navy, the Americans were able to quickly deploy U.S. Marines and Army forces on the hundreds of islands under Japanese control across the South Pacific. The strategy worked well,